So gathered skirt, page 173, on Winifred Aldrich. So the gathered skirt. So something like this, something that would turn out a bit like this. Okay, we're going to mainly look at just the skirt part. So the gathered skirt, so diagram 3, and she has 3A is slightly gathered, you see, and 3B is very gathered. So she actually has two slightly different skirts diagrammed here, first on her flat drawings and next on her diagrams here. So this is like a skirt that's slightly gathered. There's only a little bit in there. It's a small rectangle, essentially. And this is a much larger rectangle. So you can have a larger amount of gathers or a smaller amount of gathers. And that's what she's talking about there in that first line. And that's what she is showing in her working drawings or her flat drawings. Then you can see here, this one says slightly gathered, and we have our diagrams here, and this one says very gathered, and it has it there. And it's simply a larger rectangle, and these are two narrow rectangles. So we have a small amount of instructions here, which makes it a simple draft, but there's straight away language that she's using that is a little bit confusing. So her first line is cut two rectangles, semicolon, depth equals skirt length, comma, width equals 1/4 hips plus 15 centimeters. Then she says curve the waistline 1.5 centimeters higher at the side seam. So that is her full instructions for this diagram and how to make a gathered skirt. So she doesn't give you a lot of instructions, so you have to interpret them. So when she says cut two rectangles, the funny thing about Winifred, she uses the word cut a lot, and from the beginning I say to people that when Winifred says cut, we will not be cutting, we will be tracing something first before we cut it. So there's always a step when she says cut. For us, there's always a step before it where we trace something. What she really means there is, what I will interpret it to mean, is we're going to draw two rectangles. All right, after that we can cut them out and they'll be our pattern pieces, but essentially we're going to draw two rectangles. We can see them there, and the depth equals the skirt length. So when she's talking about the depth here, how long do we want the skirt? And then the width is 1/4 of the hip plus 15. In terms of the 1/4 of the hips, the hip is the widest point on the female form, okay, for the skirt part. So we need to be sure that we come and that the skirt is wide enough at the top to go over the hip, okay, because I don't see any zip on this. The gathers need to be a minimum of this width so that they can pull up past. All right. Then she's given you an amount plus 15. That's just an amount extra, so to add a little bit for a slight gather. You can add much more, because in the very gathered skirt she gives you, she says the same instruction, skirt width, and then she says approximately 3 times the hip size. So you can come the hip measurement and just out about 15, or you can come 3 times it. So it's showing you that you can do a very large gather or a very small gather. In terms of following her diagrams, this is the one we're doing. So we want our paper to look somewhat like that. So if we're doing a kind of a rectangular shape and we know we're going to have a second one, we don't want to start this over here. We're going to run out of paper. So just be wise about where you're starting. Also, if we're going to start up here, always leave a little bit of space on the top of your page and along the side in case for notes. It's really important to take your notes and write them right onto your diagrams. The next thing that we're doing, which is complicated and a little tricky at the beginning, is we're going to half everything. You are going to half everything. So I am going to draw something in full scale up here, and you are going to convert it in half all the time. And I will always write the full scale measurement, and so people will say to me, is that half scale? It is not half scale. It is always going to be full scale on here, and it is your job to convert it into half scale. So we'll We will do this slightly gathered. So, so starting with a line on this side of the page, on your left-hand side of the page, we draw a nice line. We draw the line first and then we'll measure on it after. And we'll come out here at the top. So practice your squaring, get your set square. If I'm to square out from here, we're squaring out, or we're drawing a perpendicular line, or a right angle line, or a line at 90-degree angle. Okay, so sometimes I'll put a little square here. That means we have squared out. So how far are we coming down? Here is our length. So in this case, and in many cases with this book, she doesn't tell you those things because it's the designer's choice. So that one is about 45. So I'm going to say 50 centimeters down is the length that I want, okay, today for my skirt. So if I go down 50, that means you go down 25. I usually will put all of the half scale measurements in red. So I measured down 40 there, and then I'm going down an extra 10. And so in brackets in red, I have written 25. And we're going to square across again. Again, we haven't been given a measurement yet, so just let your line run across for the time being. And then we can measure onto it. Okay, so we have done our depth, as she called it, or like I would kind of call it our skirt length, but she's calling it the depth there. And then she says the width, so this is going to be coming across, so this is a cross here, and that is going to be 1/4 of our hip measurement plus 15 centimeters. So where is our hip measurement and where would we get that measurement?
The basic body measurement?
Yes, the basic body measurements at the beginning of the book. So that's page 10 and 11. So to remind you that that's how you use her book. She'll tell you something like that, hip measurement, and she's expecting if she says hip measurement, you go back and you find your hip measurement. Okay, so the hip is 94. So we need to divide that by 4, 23.5. So we're going to come out 23.5, full scale measurement. Then we're going to come out after that 15, 20. So for me, I wouldn't square down. As I was saying when we were working on the blocks, I don't like to square and square again. I feel like things get a little inaccurate as I go around like that. So I would measure out this amount on my bottom line, and then probably once again in the middle, and then draw a line. I feel like that's going to be more accurate. So we've created a rectangle, but this particular rectangle is designed to be a gathered skirt for size 12 female form. So what we need to do now is one last thing, which she says, which is curve the waistline 1.5 centimeters higher at the side seam. So we need to determine what the side seam is. So we need to relate to this rectangle in terms of the garment that we're making. So we need to know this is our waistline, and you can write it on there if you want. Okay, this is your center front line, so you can mark it on there. And this across from it is the side seam. And this is our hem. If you want to write hem, you can write hem. She's saying to come up 1.5 at the side seam, so I had to define which one was the side seam first. And now we're coming up 1.5, so she has given a measurement there. So half scale of that is 0.75. I'm coming up 1.5. And then it's just blended in at the top there. She just blends that point in, curves it along. Okay, so we're going to essentially do the same thing again. Okay, repeat it, but we're going to start with our center back line over here, and we're going to come this way, same amount, coming down and around, and do the same little adaptation there. So same again. So if we try and remember what we did, we first came down and we did a nice line. We then intersected it with a perpendicular line. This one is going to be called our center back line. We know the amount we came out was 23.5 and then another 15. So we're going to do those measurements again. So I can draw this line, so that line's now going to be nice and parallel to that. And then we came down 50. And then a square across. And then I came up my 1.5 at the side seam. So after I came up that bit, I'm just going to blend it back in a nice curve shape. So now we have our construction of our slightly gathered skirt. The next thing we're going to do is do our pattern pieces. So when we're tracing off, we need to trace off everything that we need to know, and we need to also ignore things that we don't need to know, as in any construction lines that we use to get to this finished point. So I'm going to put a piece of paper down and I'm going to trace around the outside edge all the way around, which is a rectangle that has a slight angle here. And then we're going to add our seam allowance and our hem allowance. So when you're tracing off, always do leave a little bit of room around, because you're going to add things everywhere. So if you go right up against the edge, you won't have the space to add your seam allowance. So we're going to trace along. So this is my pattern now for my gathered skirt. I need to put on a label here, your center front line. That somewhere in here you have a line that has an S on it and arrows on each end, and it means that it's your straight to grain line. So I'm going to come over 11 centimeters. And I'm going to, and I drew 11, 11, 11, made my dots. I'm going to draw my line on here. And I'm going to put an arrow at the top, an arrow at the bottom, and an S. So that's my straight of grain. Another thing that we need is some notches. So when you are sewing, notches help you. So we have to put them in the pattern stage. Now Winifred does not ever, or she rarely says put in a notch. How she tells you to put in a notch, because she speaks to an intermediate level, is on her diagram. Do you see those little notches there? Like the little sort of square shapes? Yeah. They are her notches. So she never writes it in writing. So what you're supposed to do is interpret, look at the diagram, and know, okay, Winifred doesn't tell me where my notches are. I finished my pattern. I need to look at Winifred's diagram, because that's how she tells me where to put the notches. Where does she put her notches? She's put notches on the side seam. It's better really if we put the notches on the construction. So this is our side seam. She has a longer skirt than me, so she has 2 notch points, and a second notch, because actually she has a longer skirt. I've only done a 50 centimeter skirt, so I would do a length notch about every 20 to 25 centimeters, full scale. So if this is 50, then I'm going to go about halfway and put a notch, and that is going to be 25 full scale. The notch is to indicate a position that matches with this one. So you have to come the very same amount down on that one. So it's a little bit like a jigsaw. You know, when you have a jigsaw and it has the piece that sticks out and the piece that sticks in, you know, and that's how you know they go together. That's what the notches are like. And now I need to do my labeling on this pattern piece. So you find a spot on your pattern piece that has a space for your labeling. I'm going to draw 4 lines because it's to indicate that you have 4 pieces of information that you need on there. Something that marks it as yours. What I'm asking you to do is put your name, your initial, your mark, okay? The name of the garment. So this is a very abstract piece, isn't it? We don't know what it, you know, is it the bottom of a coat? Is it part of a trouser? Is it a bit of a sleeve? Like, I have no idea what that is until we say what garment it is from. So the gathered skirt, so that's the name of this skirt. The next piece is which part of the garment it is. So in this case, we have 2 pieces. We have a front and have a back. They're very similar, but they need to be marked as front and back. So this is our front. So if we are looking at this diagram, is there a seam down our center front on that skirt? No. This is our center front. So there is no seam. So what we do is we say that we are cutting that on the fold. Okay, so we have to fold the fabric behind here and then cut around. And if we do that, like this isn't the exact same skirt, but this is cut on the fold, this is our skirt, and we fold the fabric over, we cut around, and then when we open it out, it's a full little skirt, okay? If we cut 2, we end up with 2 halves, yeah? So for the, like the back. And another thing I do if something's on the fold is I draw little arrows there. That helps us draw attention to the fact that this is on the fold, that line. That line does not get seam allowance on it because it's cut to the fold. However, the rest of it will get seam allowance because the top, the waistline, if we look at our flat drawing, has a waistband. So this is going to sew to a waistband, it needs seam allowance. This is a side seam, is going to sew to the back, it needs seam allowance. And then what happens at the bottom? The bottom of our skirt needs to have a hem allowance. So I'm going to come down, I'll do the hem allowance first. Coming down, 4, 4, 2. And now the seam allowance. The seam allowance in full scale is 1.5. That's the standard measurement of seam allowance we use no matter what, whether you're menswear, womenswear. It's a little bit bigger than the professional seam allowance, which is usually 1 centimetre. But with the big one, I'm placing the 1.5 line against my line. And then you see I can do it, I can add the seam allowance very quickly. And I can even add the curved seam allowance, just means I have to curve the set square a little bit as I go. Because it's a lot of work to keep measuring out 1.5, 1.5 and putting little dots and joining them. Also, professionally, 1 centimetre is the kind of normal seam allowance, so 0.5 would be a proper half scale of a professional pattern. And then one of the last things you need to do is you need to extend, all these lines need to go through your seam allowance because they are actually some of the most important bits of information. So if we don't pull the line through the seam allowance, we don't know where this point is, and so we don't know where to snip. So after you've constructed your pattern, when you trace off your pattern piece, there's several things to check. There's your notches, there's your labeling, there's the straight of grain, okay, which needs to go on. At least if you have center front line and center back line for first year, I'll give you the credit for that, because typically that's going to always be your grain. But better again is to draw in the grain. and then there is your seam allowance, hem allowance, and the extensions, as I call them. So that is your final pattern piece. Again, you then trace around this and do the very same thing on here. The only thing that will be different is it will say back. Yeah, so I'll trace this off. We're going to need to put seam allowance on the back because there is a waistband on there, meaning that it's not elasticated waistband like the one that I have. It means that there needs to be a zip coming down. So she hasn't drawn it for us, which isn't that helpful, but we have to use our knowledge and information to estimate what's happening at the back and make a good choice.